you come back from Easter holidays, you get maybe another week, but there's no formal lecturing, right? And then it's just handing in your assignments and exams and all that kind of stuff. Ha! Man, it's so close now to the end, right? So in that regard, I'm going to try to cover a lot of stuff conceptually that you could potentially use, and we'll see how far we get in terms of talking a little bit about character animation setups. So that's one thing. The other thing, in terms of kind of news, I have to flip off at 10 o'clock because I have MArts student presentations that I got to co-invigilate with Phil, right? So we got an hour session here, but we're back in the afternoon, right? So we're going 9 to 10, and then we're going to pop back in, and we're doing our 12 to 2 session after that. Okay? So there's that. Now, let's see, what else did I want to talk about? I think that's pretty much it. Okay, so any questions or concerns? Oh, really? I've opened up permissions, and I've also set an invite link that has no expiration on it. Well, I'm just wondering, have you got a message from Sam saying he can't get in? Oh, there he is. Yeah, perfect. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so we're coming up on sort of the end of the year, pretty much, right? So that's something that I kind of want you guys to be aware of. Um, and yeah, I think that's all I wanted to cover before sort of diving in. Okay. So a lot of the structure stuff that I'm about to kind of engage in is very familiar stuff to me. However, when it comes to connecting up player-driven animations, I have not done that in several years. My primary experience with character animation inside of Unreal is to do pre-canned animated sequences for previs and that kind of a thing inside of Unreal. However, conceptually, we can talk about what's involved in terms of getting animations in. So I'm going to try and talk you through some basics, because there's a few of you here that will need to understand a couple of different concepts. And then we'll dive right into it, and I'll talk a little bit about how animations are structured in terms of player-controlled, player-driven stuff inside of Unreal. Right. So that's what we're going to try and hit up today. I might have to continue this on in the afternoon, and at some point, I want to, at the very least, show you the FBX pipeline in terms of getting your assets from a third-party creation utility or a creation package, content creation package like Maya, into Unreal, and how it sort of parses the data and deals with that, right? So that's kind of what we're looking at today. Now, what you see before you is nothing fancy, right? So all we're looking at right now is the third-person template, which I'm sure some of you guys have already played with the addition of the Anim Starter Pack. And I think I set this up last class. That's it. Very, very simple, basic kind of scenario. And it's something that I sort of encourage you guys when you're testing out new sort of ideas, or you just want to have a play with new technology, or experiment in areas of Unreal, to start with a blank project, right? Because you remove a lot of the unknowns, right? So when we're inside of Unreal, we can flip over from dev mode to game mode by heading over here. Now, usually we have, let me do this real quick. Usually we have a full interface where we can see all the viewport kind of icons. But if you need to choke up your window for whatever reason, you will see this drop-down arrow. Right? And over here, we can flip over into play mode, right? So now we are experiencing this purely from the gamer's point of view, right? You know, and it's sort of very standard basic animations, right? Now, if we want to try to interact with the UI, we're sort of stuck because we're in this game mode, game execution mode, right? So to get out of that, we hit the escape key and we have our mouse, right? we're back in here. Now, if we want to, just trying to remember the hotkey for this now. Is it Shift? Was it Tab? Yeah, okay. So if we want to stay in game mode, right? Shift. Shift plus F1. Oh my God. Very basic hotkey, I can't remember. What I wanted to show you was that you can pop out of the game mode, so the game is actually running, and you can regain control of the mouse with the tilde key. And there is a hotkey that allows me to navigate around my world space as well to kind of examine what my game mode is doing. But never mind that. That's for a little bit later on. Let's come out of the game mode by hitting escape, and we're back in editor mode. Now, one of the things I like to do in terms of the launch options, the active play mode, is I like to set it to the new editor window, right? So that way I have like a game screen. So I'll put this on a secondary monitor, and that will allow me to sort of view the experience purely from the player's point of view, right? And so you got all your controls in here. Okay, so let me reestablish my windows that tend to shut down like that. Okay, so the first order of business is to talk to you about how Unreal Engine structures itself in terms of data. And the first thing I'm going to do is talk about this idea of blueprints, right? So for this, I'm going to pop in and set up a couple of folders. Now, when you first load into the third-person template, you will get these folders here, right? A folder for the third-person blueprint, third-person folder itself with the geometry, the mannequin folder that contains our character blueprint and animation data, and our geometry folder. It's not the best organization that I've seen, but we'll walk through it and we'll take a look at a few different things inside there, right? I have, in addition to that, the animation starter pack, and we'll be exploring this one as well. All almost separate from the third-person template. It's just an additional starter pack content that we can explore and investigate, right? So that's that. Let's pop into the geometry folder, and I will come in here. There's a meshes folder. Yeah, let's do it in here. So inside the meshes folder, right, we can see that we have some geometry. So I have talked to you guys a little bit about blueprints, but I'm going to sort of expose it at an even simpler level, right? So let's say we take a look at, let me bring this guy in, 1 meter cube chamfer, right? And we'll pop this guy up. Was it page down? No. What was it that dropped that object? Well, we'll just snap it to the ground. Okay, so we have a piece of geometry, and that's all it is in terms of the static mesh geometry that we have, right? Now, if I come in here, I can right-click and I can create a blueprint class, which up until this point, we've talked about it being sort of a nodal-based coding kind of arena. But at its very base, I'd like to explain how you can utilize it when you're designing your levels to a certain degree. You'll see what I'm getting at in a second, right? So let's say we got that 1 meter cube chamfer, right? Now I'm going to create a blueprint, and I'm going to call it the cube chamfer BP. I'm putting BP under there just to specify that is a blueprint, right? And it's oftentimes really, really good to create a new folder and separate these guys out, right? And I'll show you why in just a second, right? So I'm gonna move this guy over into here, right? Move that there. And let's open this guy up, right? So in here, I'm gonna take this blueprint menu off, right? And we'll talk a little bit about it, right? So I think in a previous lecture with you guys, we jumped into the event graph and we started designing things. That's right. I did the flickering torch with you guys, right? But yeah, at an even more basic level, right? What I can do is I can come in here and let's go back to our content. And we will go back to our meshes. And I'll take my chamfer cube and I'll just pop it in here, right? So the reason I'm doing this is just to show you, I could probably take this guy and pop that in there as well. Where are you? Cube. Oh, duh, that's a material. Okay, so I've added the material, but I can come in here, add the regular cube in there as well, right? And maybe want to do something like that. Who knows, right? So I'm just going to compile this and save it, right? And I'll pop that window up here, right? So what a blueprint is, even before we talk about the flickering torch and all that kind of stuff, a blueprint is a container for an asset that you can pop into the world, right? So there it is, right? Now, the beauty of the blueprint, right, is that the blueprint can at a space level group geometry for you, all the way up to doing a whole bunch of stuff to that asset, whether it's a procedurally animated technique or triggers or, reacts to stuff. It could be a door opening thing, right? But the idea behind the blueprint is that it is more than simply a piece of geometry, piece of static mesh, right? It's, I guess, static mesh with a bunch of features attached to it, right? So I've found that quite a few people are under the misconception that blueprints are for gameplay, sort of functional gameplay code, and it's not necessarily the case, right? So, hang on a sec. Okay. I just got a message in the chat about F-Track, so let's see if we can sort that out before I have to head off for my 10 a.m. Okay, so are you guys clear about what blueprints are and how they generally tend to work? It's probably all good. It's very straightforward. Because the next thing I'm about to do is layer a whole bunch of complexity on top of you. It's going to be an overwhelming amount of information, but don't worry, it all kind of makes logical sense, and I'll try and connect up these ideas for you, right? So I think I'll spend the next half hour actually talking about graphs and showing you graphs as opposed to sort of jumping into Unreal per se, but it'll give you sort of a structural overview of kind of everything that's going on, if that makes sense, right? So let's, where did I have that window open? This one. Oh yeah, it's in here. All right. Oh, I'm missing a graph. Actually, let's pop open another graph here. Now, the one thing, as I'm opening this up, I'll just sort of talk through. One of the things that's complicated and sometimes daunting about creating animations inside of Unreal is the sheer number of dependencies that take place to get an animated character to move around. But it's fairly straightforward, right? There's not a lot of, you don't have to think programmatically to a certain degree. And it's really about understanding how things connect up, right? So let me just see if I can get to that. There we go. So I wanted this picture as well. See if I can open this guy in here. There you go. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about getting an animated character moving around, right? And to do this, let's take the example of a walk to a run being driven by a controller, right? So what do we need to get this to work, right? What we need is a walking animation and a running animation. We also need a blend. I was pausing because I was wondering whether to ask you guys, but I'll just tell you. We need the walking animation. We need a running animation. We need a blend between the two. We need a transitional animation. Otherwise, character would just walk and then snap to a run, right? Which you'll see in a lot of like 80s and 90s games. So that's one of the what I call the creative animation dependencies, right? Because that's dependent on the animator to a certain degree. We do have procedural blending and transitions, but I'll talk about the problems with those, right? So we need to understand, okay, our character at some point will be walking, and then at another point will be running, but we have to make it look realistic, right? So we need that transitional blend. We also need to think carefully about how our movements connect in the gameplay experience, and that's really important. I think the best way to illustrate this is to pop back into the starter content, and let's go over to, where's my blueprint? There it is. Well, I'll open up the character blueprint. Don't freak out about how complicated it looks. We're going to talk about it. Right? So let's go into the locomotion state machine. Right? Okay. So basically, what we kind of need to think about are how are our movements going to connect up and how are they going to blend together? So for example, with my walk run exercise, we might think, okay, I'm just going to have a character walk set up inside my game engine, and then I'm going to connect up a run, and then let's see how that works. And then you start up the game and your character's walking immediately. And you go, oh crap, I need an idle. I need the character to be standing around before he starts walking. And you need a blend from that idle to that walk, right? So you can see a very basic move tree here, this locomotion state machine, that sort of helps you figure out what your character is going to be doing, right? Let's forget about controls because it gets confusing. We just need to think about what your character is going to be doing, right? So it'll go from an idle to a crouch, idle to a jump, idle to a jog. There could be idle to walk to jog, and then a run, jump, etc., etc. So you really kind of need to think about all the different movements that your character is going to be able to do. Now again, I say there's a really, really simple move tree here because in your AAA games, there's everything. There's head turns, there's expression changes, there's reloading, there's upper body reloading while the lower body's walking. There's all kinds of stuff, right? The only way to untangle that mess is to sit down by yourself or with your group if you end up on a group project and map out what your character is going to be doing at any given point. Coupled with that, you need another diagram with your controller. And this is oftentimes what we do. We'll take just an Xbox 360 controller, or sorry, Xbox One controller, or a PS4 controller, or PS5, and we'll just map out what all the buttons are going to do. And you don't have to start from scratch. The wonderful thing about living in this day and age now, you guys can download controller diagrams and use that as a launching off point. However, it is a good idea to be sort of innovative and revolutionary with your controller design. So you would sit there and go, okay, I am pushing forward on the left analog stick. So I'm going from the idle to the jog. Well, we need a transition from that idle to that jog, right? And you can either procedurally blend it inside of Unreal Engine, meaning it's like morph, meaning the character morphs from idling to jogging. But the problem with that is the standing legs will just slide apart and it'll start jogging. Or you can animate that transition, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So this forms the essential core framework of how you're going to design your animation systems, right? So let's pop back into our graph, right? The graph actually starts from the player controller blueprint and moves forward, but I'm actually starting from the anim graph with the state machines and moving backwards, because if you understand that what your state machines need, i.e. the idle, run, walk, jog, reload, right? Whatever state your character is in, then it becomes easier to think about how you're going to plan to build your dependencies, right? So there are a few things that need to exist inside your project, right? You need a player controller blueprint, right? So this just defines your character, everything about your character. So establishes camera settings, contains any special control or input settings required for the character. That's confusing. It's not about animation control. It's, what would be a good example? It's just primarily the character with no animation, if you want to think about it that way. Now, because it's a blueprint, doesn't mean that there's special code driving the character. It's just a container, just like I showed you, right? So, pawn or character blueprint establishes input behavior, contains skeletal mesh and other components needed for the character, may use an interface to send data. So here's where it starts to get complicated, because you got to start thinking like Unreal Engine, right? So with the player controller blueprint, you need to say, okay, this is the character, and the camera for the character, we'll talk third person camera, will have to sit over the shoulder from behind, right? The pawn or character blueprint is the pawn blueprint rather, is an extension of that and establishes that the geometry of the character is going to be controlled by a skeleton. And that skeleton will be controlled by animation data. There's no animation data in it. It's just saying, look, you are about to receive animation data. It's kind of like opening the door to allow data in, right? And you can think of it in more technical terms like declaring variables or something like that, getting ready for sort of information to come in. So I'm being overly simplifying this, but it's just to kind of give you conceptually the idea of all the bits and pieces that are in play. Now, these guys sit outside this square for a reason, because they simply deal with the character that you've brought in, right? So the animation blueprint, on the other hand, receives the animation data and applies it to the character, right? So you have an event graph and you have an anim graph. There's also a state machine inside that, but we'll talk a little bit about that, right? So the event graphs generally deal with events in the game, right? So the event graph kicks off when you hit the play button, right? So again, just to be needlessly pedantic about it, right? If I come in here, hit play, I've just launched my event graph, right? So now it's receiving events. It's receiving my right mouse button orbiting and my WASD keys. It's receiving all, and my space bar. It's just received that event, right? So that's what the event graph essentially does at its core. It receives events and then translates them, right? Okay, so receives data from other blueprints, yes. And we will show you how we can calculate data in one blueprint and pass it into another blueprint. Oh, you suck, man. I hate you. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, so the event graph processes incoming data, specifically controller input, right? Drive data into the anim graph. So once the event graph receives controller input, it just sends that to the anim graph, right? The event graph is very similar to a standard blueprint. Anim montages are played and controlled from here, right? So I won't get into anim montages today. They're a layer of complexity that you guys don't need to think about just yet, right? So once the event graph calculates events in the game, like controller input, it accesses the anim graph. So the anim graph receives data from the event graph, i.e. controller push, processes that incoming data, and drives the skeletal mesh animation. Pretty much play this animation that we've brought in an FBX file, right? The anim graph is itself a container, right? So let's take a look at that. It might be easier to sort of wrap your head around if we take a look at it. So let's pop back in here, and I'm going to go to my anim graph, right? So the Anim Graph itself inside the blueprint is receiving data from our locomotion state machine, right? Which is, if I double click it, is this guy in here, right? So I've double clicked my Anim Graph connected to my locomotion, right? So here we're in our locomotion state machine. And if I double click on the jump, we have a sort of node that plays jump from stand and outputs that animation pose, right? So the Anim Graph is just sort of a package that contains a bunch of stuff that controls your character animation, right? So here we've got state machines, blend spaces. A blend space is where, remember I said you could procedurally blend from a walk to a run? You do that inside of a blend space, which is like a mini editor, a mini animation editor that you can play with, right? Slot nodes inside the blend space, we'll talk about that. And anim sequences. Anim sequences are what you create and export into Unreal, right? So this is literally the animation sequences, right? So if I come over here, I'll let's grab a death animation, right? I've double clicked it, and here's my animation sequence, right? And as you can see, we've got quite a few different anim sequences, right? So this is what I'm talking about. There are a lot of bits and pieces to connect up when you're thinking about character animations, right? So what's not evident in this graph as well is that the Anim Graph will then connect to your animated sequences, which you've created inside of Maya, right? So you've got all the, deaths, reload sequences, firing, melee, whatever, right? So that's sort of the basic structure of how to get animation to work inside of Unreal. There's quite a few more bits and pieces that we need to talk about, right? To kind of get this all fully together. Let me just pop up my animation. So any questions about that so far? Nope. Okay, that's cool. All right, so let's see. Just making sure I'm covering everything. Popping open my notes here. Anim Graph state machine. Yeah, okay, so I'll build on that. So again, the animation blueprint is your container. Yeah, the only thing I've added on my notes here is event graph, anim graph, and then the locomotion sort of state machine, which is kind of like the locomotion state machine is kind of like a mini container for smaller anim graphs. Right, so we got your event graph, your main anim graph that brings in information from the state machines, and then you got these state machines with little mini anim graphs, like crouch to prone, that could be a little mini anim graph, walk to run, another little mini anim graph, right? And then that's all plugged into your state machine, which is plugged into a larger anim graph, which is accessed by your event graph, right? This is what I was talking about. With character animation, it is complicated, but it's also straightforward. It's straightforward in that all the bits and pieces that you use, there's nothing complicated. You don't have to create anything on the fly. It's all just about assembling all the bits and pieces together. But there are lots of bits and pieces to sort of play with. Okay. One sec, guys. I think I heard a knock at my door. I will be right back. 1 second. Cheers, guys. Sorry about that. My wife's out, so I thought she'd come back, but it was just the mail dude. Okay. So the animation diagram, you can access this in the Unreal Engine documentation if you want notes. But the reason why I wanted to walk you through it is it's not very intuitive when you read through the graph. So I wanted to explain to you guys exactly what's going on and how all the bits and pieces connect up, right? So that's inside of Unreal. Outside of Unreal, we have creation diagram. Okay. This is actually the first time I'm reading through this. Okay, so the two things that you need out of a creation package like Maya is skinned geometry, and we talked a little bit about that, the geometry, the joints, and then the skinning information. And then we need the animations themselves. Now, this confused me in the early days when I started doing game animations, but the animation data can exist separate from the skeletal mesh or the geometry of the skeleton, right? In fact, that's what you'd like to do, is to keep them separate and then connect them up together once you get inside of Unreal, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about the FBX export pipeline, right? So again, the file format of choice, well, actually it's now kind of embedded inside of Unreal, is the FBX file format, right? Which originally started off being a motion capture data file format, surprisingly enough, developed by a company called Cadera way back in the day. The FBX is short for Filmbox. That was the name of the company, I believe. So it was Cadera Filmbox, rather. So the FBX file format came from there. Now, the reason why the FBX file format became industry standard is just, it was rock solid. It went through a little dodgy period in about 2008 or so, but it's rock solid. The geometry that you get from Maya using FBX, that you import into Houdini, that you import into Unreal, that you import into ZBrush, just stays the same. It's rock solid, right? So the FBX file format is second to the OBJ file format. Now, the OBJ file format, which some of you guys have already worked with, is just geometry. It's just vertex data. You can't break it. The OBJ is one of the best file formats on the planet for just exchanging vertex information, right? The FBX file format takes the vertex information of an OBJ and adds animation, adds lights, adds cameras, right? So you can add quite a lot of stuff in here. For our intents and purposes, we just want the geometry, skeleton, and animation, which the FBX file format does. So you can see we've got the skeleton and the skeletal mesh, which can be confusing, but the skeletal mesh is just the character geometry with some skinning information, right? The skeleton is kind of a separate asset. Let me show you. And again, it can be quite confusing. Let's pop into the mannequin, right? So inside here in the mannequin, right, we have got the skeletal mesh, and when I double click on it, right, it should open up our character geometry editor thing, right? And so this gives us details about the geometry, and then we can climb up the tree to the animation all the way up to the character blueprint. So up here it shows what that skeletal mesh is attached to later on down the pipeline, right? So that's just the skeletal mesh. We also have a physics asset, which is the collision geometry and a few other things that are attached to it. And then we have just the skeleton itself, right? Which, this is the confusing thing, will pop up the character again, but it will give you a hierarchy of the joints and bones controlling that geometry, right? So I think, talking it through, I think what makes it confusing is that skeletal mesh and skeleton are treated as separate entities, but they are so closely dependent on each other, we just think of them as the character, right? And then, of course, your animation sequences, which I talked really briefly about, right? So we will start off with, oh yeah, okay, it doesn't do that. Okay, so there are a few things that we can create inside the content browser, which will be sort of important. I don't like the order of this, because you generally start off with putting together your player controller blueprints or your pawn and character blueprints. Now those, again, are the blueprints that just deal with the character and receiving controller information, right? Then you create your, I'm going to replace anim montages with anim sequences for now. The anim montage is, for lack of a simpler way to describe it, it just allows you to multi-layer animation. It's like an animation sequence with a whole bunch of layers to it, so you can really sort of tweak and fine-tune your animations, right? But for our intents and purposes, just talking about anim sequences is a great place to start, and then we'll build up towards anim montages. So anim sequences, yeah. Now the anim sequences then have to be put inside blend spaces because we want to, we want one anim sequence for walking, one anim sequence for running, but then we want a blend space where we can say, look, I want to control the blending from this to this inside the blend space, right? And then that all feeds into your animation blueprint, right? Created with the animation tools inside of Unreal are things like skeletal sockets. That's the really important one. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Morph and material curves. No, I won't talk about that. Animation notifications. Yeah, I'll show you what that is. It's fairly easy, and we probably won't really talk about it. So what an animation notification is that if your animated character does something, launch something else. So the cheesiest example is when your animated character puts its foot on the ground, notify your sound bank and have it play the sound of a footstep, right? That's all it is. Animation notifies are just at certain points in your animation, you can send signals and messages to other effects to happen, right? And then, of course, state machines, which I've talked a little bit about. Edited in the animation tools, we have mini editors inside of Unreal. The blend space editor is quite fun. I've shown you the blueprint with the event graph and the anim graph. And we'll take a look at the animation sequence editor. I don't think I'll cover skeletal sockets today, nor morph target and material curves. Animation notifies, I've just explained to you, and state machines, right? So that's kind of the structure of how you assemble animation inside of Unreal, how you create animations or modify animations once you're inside Unreal, right? Okay, that was quite a bit. Any questions about that stuff? Is this all stuff you guys already know? Some of you guys might. No? Okay, that's cool. Okay. If not, then it's good that I'm passing on new information to you guys. Okay, so let's take a look at another interpretation in terms of how we connect all of this stuff up, right? So that was just off the Unreal documentation. It's kind of in list format, and I find it sometimes helpful to look at the connections and the dependencies in a larger scale, right? Okay, so here we are inside of Maya. We are creating our skeleton and skeletal mesh. Remember, our skeleton carries our animation data, right? So our skeletal mesh is the geometry with the skinning information, for lack of a better way to describe it, right? Actually, let's pop out here, right? Now, all of that feeds into, well, first of all, before it feeds into the anim blueprint, we use that and we create animated sequences. So these are created inside of Maya and then exported out, right? So typically we would have one asset for the skeletal mesh, one asset for the skeleton, and a whole bunch of assets for animation sequences, right? Then we got our physics assets. We don't have to worry about that today. And then that all feeds into our animation blueprint. And that animation blueprint is driven by the event graph, and the event graph plays our animation graph, right? And then as the animation graph plays, it spits out a result every single frame, right? So at frame, well, there's no frame 1 to frame 20. How Unreal keeps track of time is through ticks. So the minute you hit play, straight away it goes tick, 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 and it's counting game ticks, right? So for every single tick, it's calculating a pose and it's rendering it, right? So you can't get any simpler than that, right? So in that regard, when we start talking about how things connect up, try to keep this kind of idea in mind in terms of how things are dependent on each other and how we put them all together. This one is an uber complicated diagram that takes it sort of one step further, right? Trying to figure out how I can maximize this. You can't really minimize this divider. Can we eliminate the divider? No, we can't. Jesus. All right. Okay, so this particular animation pipeline poster expands on this very, very basic, simple idea, right? So let's kind of zoom in here and take a look at where we are going to be in terms of the creation pipeline, right? So we're going to be looking at animated sequences, right? So in here, again, our animated sequences are originally authored in Maya and contained in the FBX file format, right? And it's imported in, and it comes in as sequences. The sequences themselves have animation curves. Maybe not animation notifies or sync markers because we have to build those inside of Unreal, but you'll get animation curves, right? From those sequences, we'll be able to build our blend spaces, like blending walk to run. We'll be able to create montages. I'll explain a little bit about a montage. So we might have a walk to run. We might want to build in a little bit of a stumble, right? Or we might want to, put in a limp or, something like that, right? We can start to layer in detail, but maybe we don't want to animate it as a separate animation sequence and blend it in. Maybe we just want this overall, let's just say we want an overall walk to run montage with all the little subtleties, right? So we would take that blend space, we would build upon it inside of an animation montage, right? Okay, so that, for me, sort of typifies primarily the creation process of animation and getting it into Unreal. We'll talk about actually getting this stuff into Unreal in just a second, right? So if we come down to the skeletal mesh and the skeletons, because remember, we just pulled in animation curves up here, right? We're bringing in the skeletal mesh, which is connected to the skeleton, and the skeleton connects itself to the animation sequences, of course. So the animation data itself knows what to manipulate, and that's our skeleton. We got the physics asset, which we won't talk about, and we got the control rig, which we won't talk about, right? So that all kind of culminates here with the sequences in the animation graph. The animation graph, again, is driven by the state machine and event graph, which we talked about. So remember, this event graph is gameplay. The state machine is really about transitions from one animation to another, driven by the controller and a pawn class and other variables, right? And that all sort of gets calculated per tick or per frame, and then that pose is rendered out, right? And then so this particular sort of chart expands on that a little bit. So what I might do is drag these guys. I should have thought of this before and prepped for it, but oh no, I got it here. Okay, so I'm going to drag these guys into our, I'm going to put it in the indie game, the IGD indie game development chat, right? So it's there in just sort of one place. So I'm going to pop the basic kind of graph in there, and then I'm going to pop in the animation sort of pipeline poster. The file is too big. Get out of here. Okay, I think I've got a smaller version of the schematic. Let's see. No, I don't. Okay, well, that's okay. The animation poster, or the schematic for the workflow pipeline is really complicated. I think perhaps I'll just leave you with this one for the time being. Yeah, no snippet. Don't make me do the work. I don't want to go compress it. Yeah, I know. I'm just being lazy. All right. Okay. All right. I'll do it. All right. So let me pop in these other two sort of conceptual illustrations. I think they will be quite helpful. Let's go into the animation diagram. Bada-bong. And the creation diagram. Yeah, the best way to kind of compress this is to just come over here and just do a real quick print screen. Although the print screen might not get the resolution you need. Don't make me zip it, guys. Let's see. Will this be readable? No, you can't even read it. All right, I'll zip it. Man, you guys are a demanding bunch. Okay, so let's 7-zip this. Okay. Right. So that's sort of a general overview of how things work. And I find that this kind of overview is sort of helpful because once we start diving into the bits and pieces, it is quite easy to get, oh, I didn't gain all that much. Guys, I only gained a meg, it looks like. Let's see if it'll go. It's not going to go. All right, I'll find a different way to get it to you guys. I'll pop it in the university OneDrive and I'll send you a OneDrive link. All right. So, yeah. Zip it. Okay, so let's kind of take a look. Ooh, I got 4 minutes left. So let's take a look at the Animation Starter Pack. Now remember, the Animation Starter Pack and all the rest of this, it's the same thing, right? All the rest of it is the basic animations implemented in the third-person template. Animation Starter Pack is almost the same thing, a little bit better. Animations are better, more variety of the animations, but it's just the animation data, right? So let's take a look at this, right? Now, one of the things that is quite intimidating is that this list is quite huge, right? So let's start off by creating a new folder, and this will be for my blueprints, right? And you can recognize the blueprints because they have color coding underneath, if you can see, right? So I'm going to grab my character blueprint, the character blueprint class and the anim blueprint, and we'll move those guys in here. That way we can look at it as a separate kind of entity in and of itself, right? Now, it should fix up all the redirectors and dependencies and all that kind of stuff, so we should be okay. Now, I also want to create a folder for our blend spaces. Blend species, is it? No, that's right. I did spell it right. And actually, I wonder if I can let's just do a filtered search, right? So for the blend spaces, we've only got 2, the jog and the crouch. That's cool. So I'll come back here. That'll make it easy for us to jog and the crouch. That'll make it easier for us to talk about in just a second. And I think the rest is just, we got level map. So I'm going to create a new folder for, I always struggle. Do I call it levels? Do I call it maps? I think Unreal wants to call it maps. Oh, I'm used to labeling it as levels. So we'll move that there, right? And I believe the rest should simply be animation data, right? So I'm going to create a new folder for animation. And we'll sort of explore this, right? Yeah. So I'm going to pop this in here. So this has got a lot of connections. So what it's doing is it's disconnecting, unloading, reconnecting, and it should have sorted it out okay for us. I don't know. So I'm going to again, separate these guys out in terms of aim. There's only 2 for the aim. There's a bunch for crouch. So let's grab a new folder for crouching, right? And so on and so forth. I like to package these guys up this way because it makes it a little bit easier for me when I need to find stuff and organize stuff. But also in terms of thinking about, okay, I've got my state machines and my move set. One of them is crouch. How many crouches do I need, right? And then we've got our death animations. And I'll talk, actually, death animations is a good thing to talk about. Because there's dying standing up, there's dying crouched, there's dying firing, there's so many different death animations that that you could be working with, right? We got equipping, etc., etc. So I'll probably just run through and organize all of the different animations into their own separate folders so we can take a look at them individually when we reconvene, right? And then what we'll do is we'll take a look at the third person template and we'll deconstruct it in terms of how they've connected everything up. Okay, so I think, let me just check my notes. I want to make sure that I've covered. Oh, I'm being called by Phil into my presentation. So I'll leave it at that, and I will see you guys after lunch. Okay? I'll see you guys.